Bagan was an ancient kingdom located in present-day Myanmar, founded in the 9th century by Burman people who migrated from present-day Yunnan in China. The kingdom existed for nearly 4 centuries until its collapse near the end of the 13th century. There are very few historical records directly from the Bagan Kingdom. Most of our information comes from contemporary Chinese and Indian chronicles. Archaeological evidence as well as oral histories have been crucial in piecing together the history of this ancient kingdom. In this video, we will be discussing the history of the rise and fall of one of Southeast Asia's major ancient kingdoms, the Bagan Kingdom. Before we begin, I would like to thank you for visiting my channel, Stories in History, and I hope you'll enjoy your time here. Now back to the video. Bagan's first king, Pinbia, established the capital city of Bagan, or modern-day Bagan, in central Myanmar. The kingdom benefited greatly from its wealth and strategic location along landed and sea routes crossing China, India, and Southeast Asia. From 849, the kingdom slowly expanded into neighboring Mon and Shan states in the region through conquest and diplomacy. At Bagan's height in the 11th century, the kingdom became one of the most powerful states in Southeast Asia and a major rival to the contemporary empire of the Khmer in the southern part of continental Southeast Asia. King Anarahata, who ruled between 1044 and 1077, is regarded as the greatest ruler of the Bagan. Under his reign, he unified much of modern-day Myanmar and led the kingdom into a golden age of cultural and religious accomplishment. Anarahata introduced Theravada Buddhism into the kingdom and constructed thousands of pagodas and temples across the country, many of it still existing today. One of the most famous being Shwedagon Pagoda, located in the city of Bagan. It is widely regarded as the oldest and most significant Buddhist pilgrimage site within modern-day Myanmar. Aside from Bagan's astounding architecture, one of the most pivotal and lasting legacies of the empire was the expansion of Theravada Buddhism into Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese and Khmer also practiced Buddhism, but they ascribed to Mahayana branches of Buddhist traditions during this time period. Bagan's patronage was rather important because although Theravada Buddhism had emerged in Southeast Asia in previous centuries, it was declining in influence in both the region and the Indian subcontinent where it had developed. The rise of the Bagan Kingdom successfully rescued the school of Buddhism and even allowed it to revive in Ceylon, whose Buddhist clergy had been recently slaughtered by the Chola dynasty in southern India. As a result of Bagan's patronage of the Theravada school in the 11th century, the religion survived and expanded greatly in subsequent centuries. By the 13th, the Khmer Empire adopted it as the state religion alongside the emerging Thai states of Sukhothai and Lana. Despite the crucial role Bagan played within the spread of Theravada Buddhism, by the end of the 13th century, the Bagan Kingdom would suddenly collapse. Historians have pointed to numerous factors for the kingdom's decline during the time period, particularly environmental factors such as natural disaster and political instability, as well as various factions vying for power, weakening the kingdom's ability to resist external threats. Ultimately, it would be the 13th century invasion of Southeast Asia by the Mongols which directly caused the collapse of the kingdom. In 1271 and 1273, the Yuan dynasty sent 2 envoys to Bagan to demand tribute from the kingdom. Bagan refused to pay, and the Mongols responded by invading and sacking the kingdom. Well, that is the simple answer to why the kingdom came to a close. However, to understand how and why the kingdom came to an end, we need to understand the historical factors that contributed to the collapse, as well as the overarching history of Asia at the time. King Naratihapata, the last king of Bagan, was a controversial figure in Myanmar's history. He reigned from 1256 to 1287, and his reign marked the end of the Bagan Kingdom. Burmese and Chinese chronicles hold him responsible for the collapse of the kingdom, but the reasons for the downfall were more complex than just his actions alone. During his reign, Bagan was already weakened by internal conflicts and external threats. In 1277, Naratihapata faced a major Mongol invasion led by Kublai Khan's general, Bayan. He managed to partly defend the kingdom, but the invasion caused significant damage to the capital city of Bagan. However, in 1285, Naratihapata faced another Mongol invasion, and this time he fled the capital to Lower Burma. He later submitted to Kublai Khan in exchange for Mongol withdrawal, but his decision led to his assassination 6 months later by his son, Tihatu. Historical records generally depict him as a weak and cowardly monarch, with unbridled gluttony, an explosive temper, and a penchant for envy and arrogance. Kublai Khan gave him the insulting title, the Swallower of 300 Dishes of Curry Daily. Moreover, Marco Polo wrote of the Great Khan's conquest of the kingdom, describing how it was achieved with little resistance, aided only by jugglers and clowns. In summary, King Narahapata is not remembered as a great or even adequate ruler. While I do not intend to rehabilitate his reputation, I do believe that the chronicles have been unjust to him. Though he wasn't an effective leader, and the fall of Pagan has been attributed to his reign, many of the challenges he faced had existed in the kingdom long before he ascended to the throne. In hindsight, Narahapata made numerous missteps that hastened the kingdom's decline. In the remaining portion of the video, I aim to provide context for these mistakes and explore the reasons behind his decisions. For one thing, Pagan paying tribute to China wasn't all that new, and it was something Pagan had already showed a willingness to do for a few centuries to this time period. During the Tang and Song dynasties, the Bagan Kingdom, like many other states throughout Asia, regularly dispatched envoys and provided tribute to the Chinese emperor. Pagan regularly sent precious goods to the Chinese court, including elephant tusk, rhinoceros's horn, and precious stones. In return, China granted gifts of silks and porcelain to Pagan kings, as well as diplomatic recognition and, most importantly, rights to trade in Chinese territory. Before we continue further, I would like to discuss a little about this phenomenon of Chinese tribute and what it signified. The Cefeng, also known as the tributary system, was an informal network of international relations that revolved around China, primarily for the purpose of facilitating trade and foreign affairs. Under this system, every state seeking to engage in trade with China was required to recognize China's preeminent position in a Sino-centric world order. The system wasn't just confined to commerce alone. On few occasions, China would use the threat of military force to enforce diplomacy with states within its sphere of influence. Although it seldom employed this tactic against more distant states such as those in Southeast Asia, at least up to the 13th century, and Vietnam of course being the exception to this rule. The Cefeng was prevalent in East and Southeast Asia until modern times. Although many states could choose to opt out of the system without significant repercussions, there were a few states that were firmly within China's sphere of influence. These included Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, which were regarded as vassal states by China. It is important to note that these states were not only subject to China's economic dominance, but also to its political and cultural influence. More distant states like Pagan and Sumatra had more indirect ties to China and acted more as tributaries. I would also like to note that China's vassal states shouldn't imply that Chinese hegemony was uncontested by each of them. Japan, most notably, would sever its vassal relationship to China during the Asuka period between 538 and 710, believing that the Japanese were equals to China and an individual and distinct culture. The Ryukyu Kingdom in southern Japan would retain their ties to China though during this time. Vietnam and Korea would also push China for recognition as equal players within the Sinosphere, which would lead to China invading them at various points in history. Japan didn't share a land border with China, so China was a little bit less heavy-handed with them. Within the Sino-centric world order, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan were assumed to have had achieved a significant level of quote-unquote civility, or conformity to the Confucius worldview. In contrast, other Southeast Asian states were assumed to be outsiders to the Sino-centric world and fell under a different system. Particularly, they were identified as tributaries. Most of these states were either Buddhist, Hindu, or a combination of Buddhist and Hindu during this time period, so arguably part of the Indosphere. This includes Pagan. Each state, regardless of status, had to send tributary envoys to China and kowtow to the Chinese emperor and acknowledge his superiority and precedence. In exchange, they would receive gifts from the emperor, peace with their much larger and powerful neighbor, and even diplomatic or military aid in some cases. However, the tributary system did not mean that kingdoms in Asia, whether it be Vietnam, Korea, Japan, or those in Southeast Asia, had to cede their sovereignty to the Chinese emperor. For the most part, rulers in tributary and vassal states largely retained their autonomy and remained virtually independent. Although for the vassal states, their respective governments were followed with closer scrutiny from the Chinese court. China wouldn't always directly intervene in their government, but did flex their economic power over them, sometimes funding and supporting political rivals within these states who were more friendly to Chinese interests. It also might be important to point out that the term tribute system did not actually exist in China during this time period, and has retroactively been applied in the modern era. The Chinese emperor did not really envision it as an institution or system at all, but rather as a set of symbolic practices states had to adhere to if they wanted to have diplomatic or economic ties to the country. So they were not specific treaties being made here, just an acknowledgement that the Chinese emperor was superior to all other rulers. It would develop more systematization under the Ming dynasty, but it still remained largely symbolic. For example, Southeast Asian states were not obliged to provide tribute through threat of force. The Khmer Empire, for instance, was not a tributary despite the former Chenla and Funan states having been ones. Here I've also provided a list of tributary states throughout history if you are interested in the subject. To the 13th century in Asia, the tributary system was a significant feature of international relations. However, a specific incident in China would ultimately result in a major shift within this system, with far-reaching consequences for the entire region. In 1271, when the Mongols established the Yuan dynasty, the first emperor Kublai Khan was eager to assert dominance in Asia and resume China's central role within the continent. And just a quick side note, the Southern Song dynasty still existed at the time, so the Yuan weren't officially recognized as emperors of China until after the Song dynasty collapsed in 1279. One of the central ways to accomplish this was by reigniting China's vast and loose network of tributaries and vassalage, which had politically and economically dominated Asia for several centuries by the 13th century. Shortly after, Kublai Khan sent dignitaries across Asia demanding states recognize Yuan control of China. One of these kingdoms was the Kingdom of Bagan. The others were Sumatra in modern-day Indonesia, Japan, and Vietnam, who all refused tribute or submission to Yuan rule. For Korea, the peninsula had already been invaded by the Mongols since 1231, and the official campaign had just concluded in 1270, although Koreans would resist the Yuan for the next 8 decades. So this brings us back to the Bagan Kingdom and the Mongols. During the Yuan dynasty in China, the Cefeng system underwent a transformation. Unlike the Tang and Song dynasties, Kublai Khan's demands for tribute entailed relinquishing the kingdom's sovereignty to Mongol rule. The Mongols typically installed puppet governments within states that they conquered, much like the Goryeo dynasty in Korea. This policy allowed the Mongols to exert greater control over their conquered territories. At the time of Kublai Khan's demand for tribute, the Bagan Kingdom was grappling with internal challenges that had deep-seated roots within the country. This goes back to 1044, when Prince Anarahata embarked on an ambitious program to expand Bagan's border beyond the city of Bagan and establish the first Burmese empire, which served as a precursor to modern-day Myanmar. Over time, under Anarahata's leadership, Bagan would consolidate its power and extend its influence over lower Myanmar, all the way from the Tesserim coast to Phuket and North Arakan. At its zenith, the Bagan Empire was only matched in Southeast Asia by the Khmer Empire to the south. However, Bagan's rise to power rested strongly on this foundation of expansionism, and when Bagan no longer grew, problems began to emerge. One of the most pressing issues facing the Bagan Kingdom was the increasing control of agriculturally productive land by powerful Buddhist monastic communities, or the Sanghas. Pagan's rulers relied on the support of Buddhist clergy to legitimize their rule and donated large tracts of land to them as a means of accumulating religious merit for better reincarnations. However, this practice had unintended consequences. As a result, the Buddhist clergy began to monopolize the best land within Upper Burma and starved the Bagan kings of a crucial base for taxation. In the end, the Bagan kingdoms in the last century had less funds to support the empire, and competing political faction and ethnic groups pushed for greater autonomy. Rebellions throughout Bagan became more frequent, and the crown struggled to put them down due to lack of financial resources to raise armies. Despite completing its territorial expansion by the 13th century, Bagan continued to donate land to the Songhas. While some kings occasionally tried to seize land by purging the clergy, such efforts were largely unsuccessful. By 1280, it is estimated that between 1/3 and 2/3 of Upper Myanmar's cultivatable land was controlled by the Songhas. In 1271, when the Yuan dynasty's envoys visited Bagan, King Naratthi-Hapata was likely unable to offer the Mongols the required tribute due to the kingdom's financial constraints. He also likely believed that submitting to the Mongols would not have solved the kingdom's problems. Confident in his ability to resist the Mongol encroachment, Naratthi-Hapata invaded the state of Qinghai, whose chief had pledged loyalty to Kublai Khan. The Mongols defended the area and, despite being outnumbered, defeated Pagan's forces and pushed into Bamo. However, the Mongols were forced to eventually retreat to China due to the heat, which may have led Naratthi-Hapata to underestimate the Yuan dynasty's commitment to conquering Southeast Asia. In 1277, Naratthi-Hapata, filled with confidence, launched a daring attack on the Mongols in Yunnan. Unfortunately, his forces were swiftly defeated, and this marked the beginning of the string of defeats for the Burmese king. Eventually, Naratthi-Hapata was overthrown, and in 1287 he was forced to flee from Bagan to Lower Myanmar. Tragically, his own son murdered him. The son would later lose the remaining parts of the kingdom to the Mongols just a few months later. Naratthi-Hapata's ill-fated battles with the Mongols are widely regarded as his greatest mistakes. In retrospect, it seems clear that these confrontations only served to provoke the Yuan dynasty into responding with even greater force. In contrast to Bagan, both Vietnam and the Khmer Empire chose to fight defensively against the Mongols and were successful in repelling their advances. Bagan's decision to engage in a direct conflict with them appears to have been motivated by a desire to expand its borders and gain new territories, something the Bagan leadership desperately needed. Most fertile lands, as mentioned before in Bagan, were controlled by the Songhas, whom Naratthi-Hapata struggled to challenge. Therefore, he shifted to focusing on acquiring new lands within Yunnan, controlled by the Yuan dynasty. However, by the end of the century, the Bagan Empire would disintegrate, with its king murdered and former vassal states controlled by the Mongols or declaring independence. For the next 250 years, Myanmar would be politically fragmented, consisting of various kingdoms and dynasties that competed for power, marking the end of nearly 3 centuries of one of the most earliest and most powerful empires in Southeast Asia. The Mongol invasion of Southeast Asia was one of the region's most pivotal historical events, which had long-lasting impacts on the various states there. The invasion culminated in the collapse of the Bagan Empire and opened a power vacuum within the northern regions of Southeast Asia. One of the most important outcomes would be the establishment of major Thai states such as Lan Na, Sukhothai, and Lan Xang. Despite armies in Vietnam and Cambodia successfully defending against assaults from the Mongols, each respective state found themselves severely weakened as a result of the war. The various Mongol invasions, including those from Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, and Timur, resulted in the deaths of between 20 and 57 million people from 1206 to 1405. In the end, the Yuan dynasty drained substantial resources in their failed attempt to conquer Southeast Asia, as well as Japan and Sumatra during this time period. As a result, it left lasting consequences for both Southeast Asia and the Yuan dynasty, which might go a little beyond the scope of this video. So once again, I thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing for additional content. I greatly appreciate your time and attention, and I hope to see you in the next video.